Okay, hi all. We'll get started. My name is Max Romalo. I'm a research officer here at the Adam Smith Institute. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Craig Biddle, who's the co-founder and editor of the Objective Standard and the founder and director of education at the Objective Standard Institute. In a previous life, Craig was a carpenter. However, he is now in the business of furnishing minds rather than use of wood, and he's furnishing our minds with the ideas of liberty, fulfillment, and objectivism. A prolific author, Craig has released this fantastic book, Loving Life, The Morality of Self-Interest and Facts That Support It. As you can tell, it's quite dogged. I'm a huge fan of this book, and I'd highly recommend it on Amazon for £15.55, or if this evening's inflation rates go up, £16. We'll see how that goes. As I said, I highly recommend it. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Craig Biddle.
Thank you, Max. Thank you. Is it going to be okay for me to walk around with this?
That should be fine.
Hopefully I won't step on it too much. I can't stay still. I'm kind of OCD that way, or what do you call it? Anyway, thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to talk about one of my favorite subjects tonight, which is Ayn Rand's philosophy for freedom and flourishing. You're all probably somewhat familiar with Ayn Rand. She's the American author, born in Russia, but moved to America and became a very well-known author. She wrote The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, We the Living, and then several nonfiction books, including Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, The Virtue of Selfishness, Philosophy, Who Needs It? And she really put a stake in the ground with a whole new set of ideas that were first developed in her fiction and then put into nonfiction form. She did not use this phrase, philosophy for freedom and flourishing, but I think it perfectly captures what she did. So I want to talk about these two values, freedom and flourishing, and what Ayn Rand's ideas provide us to support, sustain, and pursue these values. Now, I call these values, freedom and flourishing, master values, because I think everyone who is not genuinely, psychologically ill in some way wants to flourish. I mean, if flourishing is living a wonderful life and being happy. And if you don't want that, there's genuinely, it's a sad situation, and there are people who have that condition, but it's a problem. It's not a normal person. People want to flourish if they're psychologically sound. And I think in today's world, we can see a connection between freedom and the ability to flourish. I don't think it's a complete mystery that the freer countries have more flourishing, both financially and materially, and also spiritually, and in terms of sort of less tangible values, if you will. So I regard these two values as things that we can recognize, at least on some level, as really good things, really important things. And Rand's philosophy, which she called objectivism, it'll become clear why she called it objectivism as we proceed. Her philosophy really provides some solid philosophic grounding and guidance for both of these values. And we're going to start with a discussion of freedom and what she has to say about that. So what is freedom? And we're talking here about political freedom. I'm not talking about free will. We can talk about that. That's another issue. And there are other uses of the concept freedom. But I'm talking about freedom in the sense of freedom from coercion. So freedom to act on your judgment, pursue the values of your choice, keep, use, and dispose of the product of your effort, right? The kind of freedom that the American founders spoke about when they talked about you have a right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The freedom from coercion and the kind of context in which when people deal with one another, they deal with each other through persuasion and reason rather than coercion and force. So that's what freedom is, at least for the purposes of my discussion tonight. The question is this a good thing? Is freedom good? Should people be free? Now, when we ask those two questions, observe that we have already entered the realm of morality. Good and should are moral terms. So we're talking about political freedom, but as soon as we ask, is it good to be free, or should people be free, we're asking a moral question. So what's the answer? Is it true that it's good that people should be free and that people should be free? Is it the case? Well, if it is the case, then there must be some moral principle by reference to which it is the case. Things are good and bad, right or wrong. We should or shouldn't do things by reference to a moral principle. If there's no moral principle, then there's nothing there to say, well, here's the reason that you should be free, right? So you can see this, by the way, if you think of the idea that freedom, if you say people should be free and you emphasize free, you're dealing with politics because it's freedom. You say people should be free, you can see you're dealing with ethics because you're using an ethical term. So it's got a foot in both categories, if you will. So is it true? Well, the traditional answer to the question, is it good for people to be free or should people be free, is yes. And the traditional way, at least in the Western sort of liberal tradition, is yes, it's true. And if you say, well, why? What is the moral principle by reference to which it's true that people should be free? Quickly, you'll get to the concept of rights, right? So the idea is that you have a right to, and this is what the American founders talked about, right? You have a right to live your life, the right to life. You have a right to act on your own judgment free of coercion, the right to liberty. You have a right to pursue the goals and values of your choosing, right? That's the right to the pursuit of happiness. And of course, property is the right to keep and use the product of your effort. So that's the theory, is that you have these rights. But then the question arises, are rights real? Because if they're not real, if they're just made up, then saying that you have them is just saying, well, I have this made up thing. So we have to dig a little bit deeper. The traditional answer to the question, are rights real? The traditional answers to this question come essentially in three forms. And you're familiar with these, no doubt. Rights are real and they come from God. Or rights are real and they're granted by government. Government tells you what you may and may not do, and those are your rights. Or rights are real and they come somehow from our nature. Right? You've heard all of these answers. Now, there's also the answer that rights are not real. Some people say that, and we'll talk about that shortly. But each of these three theories, rights come from God, rights come from government, and rights come from nature, or are inherent in our nature in some way. Each of these is problematic. We'll start with rights come from God. So what do you have to prove in order to prove that you have rights if rights come from God? What do you first have to prove? That God exists, right? If rights come from God and you have rights and you can't prove that God exists, you can't very well prove that you have rights. So this is a very problematic situation because no one has ever proven that God exists. This is why all religions include the virtue of faith. You're supposed to have faith, accept ideas in the absence of evidence rather than on the basis of evidence. If there's evidence to support something, you're not accepting it on faith, you're accepting it on reason. Reason is the faculty that operates by evidence and logic and conceptual integration. But if there's no evidence and you're supposed to accept something, then you're supposed to accept it on faith. But if there's no evidence for God and you can't prove that God exists, then you certainly cannot prove that you have rights that come from God, much less that you have rights that are inalienable, meaning that God can't take them back from you after he gives them to you or the like. So this is enormously problematic. The second idea, the idea that rights come from government, is equally problematic. So if rights come from government, then whatever the government tells you you may or may not do, those are your rights. And this, of course, is a nightmare. If you just think about communist Russia or Nazi Germany, if your rights are whatever the government tells you you may or may not do, then in Nazi Germany, your rights, if you're Jewish, are to go into this oven and die, right? I mean, that's not going to work. In America, I don't know whether it's the case over here, but the sort of left-wing thinkers in America, use thinkers loosely there, they hold in effect that rights are whatever the government tells you you may and may not do. But that conflates the concept of law with the concept of rights. These are different things. They are not to be conflated. A law is precisely whatever a political law is precisely whatever the government or the legal system says you may or may not do. We already have a concept for that. It's called law. You don't treat rights as if it's the same thing. The whole purpose of the concept of rights is that it's something that precedes law. As the American founders put it, governments are not formed to grant rights or create rights. They're formed to protect or secure rights. Rights pre-exist government. They pre-exist a legal system. The purpose of the concept of rights is to help us to understand what kind of laws are legitimate and what governments may and may not do. That's the purpose of the concept. They're at different levels in sort of the philosophic hierarchy, if you will. So it's wrong to say that rights come from government because it's just a bastardized language. It's to treat rights as if they're the same thing as laws, which they're not. So then we get to what sounds like a much better idea, this idea that rights come from nature, that somehow we have rights by virtue of our nature. And this is a great sounding idea, except for the fact that it's problematic in multiple respects also. So what does it mean that I have rights by nature? Are they inside of me? If you cut me open, are you going to find rights inside of me? Are they out there somewhere? Can I find rights on you or in society? Here are the rights that somehow come and I find them in nature. Is that a thing? No. So that's not really going to work. And then the other idea that typically is put forth is that, well, you have rights because there's a basic natural law. And that natural law holds that you should be free to act on your judgment and keep the property that you produce, and you should be free to act on yours, et cetera, et cetera. And so now we're into a moral level because there's a natural law that says you have these rights. Then the question, of course, is, well, where did that natural law come from? And as you're probably aware, being in the land of John Locke and great thinkers of his sort, Locke and the American founders and pretty much the entire natural rights tradition holds that the natural law through which you have rights, according to them, comes from, guess where? God. Natural moral rights are not really, historically speaking, are not really natural rights. They're supernatural rights. We're just going one step removed from the level of just saying, well, they come directly from God. And instead we're saying, well, there's a natural moral law by reference to which you have rights. And that moral law, if you push and ask where it comes from, you hear from John Locke. John Locke says that our Creator granted us rights by virtue of this fact. The Creator made you, I didn't make you. And because the Creator made you, you belong to Him, not to me. So you must do His bidding, not mine. So we're back again, though, to this idea that your rights come from God. And if you can't prove that that God exists, then you certainly can't prove that rights exist. So this is the landscape of rights, in a sense, that Rand steps into, that Ayn Rand steps into as a philosopher in the 1940s and 50s, when she's becoming mature in her philosophic thinking. And Rand has a very different approach to what rights are. The first thing she notices is that rights are concepts, they're principles. So you're not going to cut me open and find them in there next to my lung. They're not physical things. You're not going to find them out there under a rock. They're concepts. They're ideas. But just because something is an idea doesn't mean that it doesn't have a reference. We use ideas all the time that have actual reference. Logic, sarcasm, there are all sorts of ideas where you can't point to the physical thing, but you know there's a thing there, right? So this is what rights are. It's an idea. Well, what is the reference of this idea of rights? Again, now we're talking about the kinds of rights that the American founders and that John Locke spoke of, the idea that you have a right to be free from force so that you can act on your own judgment or keep, use, and dispose of the property that you, or the product of your own effort. Rand's view of this is fairly complex, but I'm going to give you a simplified version now that I think is easy to get our head around, at least in an initial way of thinking about this. Rand looks at human beings, the animals that are alleged to either have rights or that we're trying to determine whether we have rights. And she says, well, what kind of animal is this? What is a human being? And she takes a very Aristotelian approach. And she says, in effect, well, we're rational animals. What does that mean? Does it mean everybody always goes by reason? Well, that's obviously not the case, especially in today's political context, we can see that. So that's not the case. But what it means is just what Aristotle and other Aristotelian thinkers have thought about the nature of human beings. It means that what's distinctive to human beings is that we have a rational faculty. And Rand further points out that our rational faculty is our basic means of living. It's the faculty by means of which we observe reality, figure out what things are, figure out how we can put them together to make bricks, and then a hut, and then a fishing rod, and this, that, and the other, all the way on up to subways and satellites and cell phones and lecture halls, right? So what is the faculty that enables us to do this? It's reason. We are a rational animal. This is what we have an emotional faculty that's very important also. We have other mental faculties, but our emotions don't tell us how to make satellites. They don't tell us how to make a heart valve. Reason is the faculty that enables us to figure out what things are, how to put them together, and therefore to live. She then asks, in effect, well, what can stop a human being from acting on his reasoning judgment, on his rational judgment? What can stop us from doing that? Well, if you strap me to a tree and leave me there strapped to a tree, I can't act on my judgment. Quite clearly, right? If I had planned to go fishing today or build a hut or go shopping, I can't do it now. Quite clearly, your force has come between my thinking and my plans to do something, and I can't do them anymore. If you put a gun to my head and tell me that I must turn my wallet over to you, clearly I must turn my wallet over to you, or the alternative is I'm going to die. And all lesser degrees of force are instances of stopping people from acting on their judgment, the one thing that they have to act on in order to live. If you own a business and the government comes in and says, well, you can't be open on Sundays and you can't sell liquor, and if you're a furniture shop, somebody says, well, you have to use this kind of sandpaper, you're not allowed to use that kind of sandpaper. Your mind cannot serve you in that sphere, because the government has outlawed your use of your mind in that sphere. So to the extent that force is used against a human being, he is unable to act on the thing that makes him human, on the thing that enables him to live, his reasoning mind. This is why slavery is wrong. A human life is a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind. If you lock someone in a cage or treat him as an animal and he can't act on his judgment, what's wrong with that is you're defying you're making it so that the man cannot live as the kind of animal that he actually is. You're obliterating that. So Rand sees this and she says, look, you know, the cliche, there ought to be a law. Well, there ought to be a law. And guess what? There is. It's a moral law. It's a law that we make. So it's a human-made law, but it's not just arbitrary. It's not just something I made up in my head. It's a recognition of a fact. So there are two parts to this idea. There's an in here part, because it is an idea. It's something that human beings came up with. Rights. Tigers don't have this idea. Fish don't have this idea. Plants don't have this idea. But we do. Where did it come from? What does it refer to in reality? It refers to a fact. It doesn't refer to a fiction. It refers to a fact. The fact that it refers to is the fact that in order for human beings to live as human beings, rather than masters and slaves, or partial masters and slaves, serfs and landlords or whatever, in order for us to live as the kind of being that we are, we must be free to act on the thing that is our basic means of living, the judgment of our mind. You see the brilliance of this idea. This is a completely different approach to what rights are. Rights are simply recognitions of the fact that for human beings to live as human beings, they must be free to act on their judgment. There's nothing mysterious about this. It doesn't come from God, doesn't come from government, and it doesn't come from nature. We know not how. We do know how now. And this is the magic of Ayn Rand's theory of rights, is that we now have an actual understanding of what this idea is, what it refers to, and the fact that it's real. The referent here is not made up. It's a fact that in order for you to live or you to live, you must be free to act on your judgment. So that's the first thing that I wanted to point out, is what Rand brings to the table in regard to rights theory and defense of freedom. She's bringing to the table something that is completely different. It doesn't fall into any of the traditional categories, because even the natural rights theory category really is not natural rights, but supernatural rights, at least historically. Because to my knowledge, and I've read a fair amount on this, no one in the history of rights theory who claimed to be a natural rights advocate was able to point to the kinds of facts that Rand is pointing to here. John Locke comes close, and in his second treatise, he makes some very important points, because in addition to saying there that because God created you, you have to do his bidding and you can't be forced by me to do mine. In addition to that, which I think is a very wrong argument, or at least it's a baseless argument, you're not going to get anywhere with it. He also points out something that dovetails perfectly with Ayn Rand's theory, and that is this: if you create something, right? So either digging dirt out of the ground and create a bowl, or if you shoot a deer, an example he actually uses in the book, you shoot a deer, what was just raw material before, raw nature before, has now become a value by virtue of your action. So what is going on here is Locke is in effect saying, he didn't use this language, but he's in effect saying, look, you caused this value to come into existence, and therefore the value belongs to you. So he's just citing the law of causality in effect to connect this. I think that's a very good thing. There's a lot of good in a lot of earlier thinkers on rights, but no one put it together the way that Rand has, fully this way, to identify what these things are and what facts of reality the concept actually refers to. And this changes everything, I think, in terms of politics, because we no longer have to debate whether or not these things exist. Do you know what Jeremy Bentham said about the kinds of rights that the American founders spoke of, the rights to, inalienable rights? Jeremy Bentham called them nonsense upon stilts. Why did he call them nonsense upon stilts? Because there's no evidence to support their existence. Alistair MacIntyre, another British philosopher, said of those rights that they are one with witches and unicorns. Why? Because there's the same amount of evidence to support their existence. Rights have been mocked for a very long time now. And the American founders, what did they say? They said rights either come from God or they're self-evident. Self-evident? Where are they? I don't see them. You see rights anywhere? That's what self-evident means. It means it's evident that's at the perceptual level. That's not the case. They're not self-evident. And you cannot prove that they come from God. So this is a sea change in rights theory from Rand. So I urge you to look further into that. I want to talk now about Rand's ideas about flourishing, about human happiness, about living a full, wonderful life, and what that means at the individual level and also in terms of social harmony, because she has a lot to say here too. And it's equally profound in my view. And as we'll see, it's going to dovetail perfectly with her whole rights theory, in a sense, because they're almost the same theory looked at from two different perspectives. So in the field of morality, the traditional way to approach it is to say, okay, well, what morality is what the church says it is, or it's what the secularists say it is, Kant or Auguste Comte or whomever. And in every one of those cases, it has something to do with self-sacrifice, at least in the modern world. Now, if we go back to ancient Greece, that's a little bit different. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But in today's world, for the past 1,000 years, the whole idea of morality has been this idea that being moral consistent, selflessly serving others, or self-sacrificially serving others. And that is supposed to be the good. Well, Rand challenged this. She said, why is that the good? What facts of reality give rise to the idea that you must sacrifice? Are there any facts to give rise to and support that idea? I say to you, you must sacrifice. You have to give your stuff to him, even though you produced it. He needs it. And anyway, just giving up your stuff is what makes you moral. So you must do that. And if you say to me, well, what facts of reality give rise to that idea? There's no there. There's nothing there. I wrote a short article based on this idea of Rand. It's called Altruism, the Morality of Logical Fallacies. And there are essentially 6 fallacies involved in this. The idea that you must sacrifice because God said so. Well, at very best, that's an appeal to authority, right? And if God doesn't exist, it's just an appeal to a made-up person or a made-up being. There's the idea that, well, society agrees that you must sacrifice. That's an appeal to the masses. That's another logical fallacy. You say, well, he needs your sacrifice. That's an appeal to pity. He may or may not feel like he needs sacrifice, but frankly, what people really need is not other people's sacrifices. They need to use their minds, think, produce, trade, and do the things that create win-win relationships. That's what people really need. They don't need, if you think about it, we don't really need sacrifice. We need freedom and thought and production. And I could go on through. There are a few more of these kinds of fallacies. But the idea here is that there are no facts that give rise to the idea that sacrifice is necessary. So Rand challenges this whole thing. And she just says, look, the very idea of a concept of good or value or should, where do these ideas come from and why do we need them? And she asks these questions and burrows down into reality, in effect, and says, if we need these concepts, there must be some reason that we need them. And her answer is basically this. We need the concept of value because it refers precisely to the things we have to produce or go after and achieve in order to live. We need the concept of good because we need a concept to identify the things that promote or advance human life as against the things that harm or destroy human life. We need the concept should or shouldn't to give us guidance about how we should and shouldn't act if we want to live and have a flourishing life, right? This is a very Aristotelian idea too. So long before Christianity came into existence and had sacrifice as the noblest ideal, and Judaism before it to some extent, but the idea that sacrifice, Jesus on a cross, is the ideal. This is the moral paragon, right? Before that, in ancient Greece, Aristotle had a whole conception of morality that had nothing to do with sacrifice. It was nowhere to be found. His conception of morality was that you should be trying to achieve what he called eudaimonia, which is essentially flourishing or happiness in sort of modern terminology. And the idea there was there are certain kinds of actions that if you take them, you'll achieve that thing. So it was very much anchored in this idea that morality is not about sacrifice, it's about pursuing life-serving values. Aristotle, to my knowledge at least, I have a friend who is an Aristotelian scholar who argues otherwise, but to my reading of his work, I still think it's fairly much the case that he did not have a way of anchoring life as the standard of moral value, the requirements of human life as the standard of moral value. He in effect turned to the successful men in Athens and in effect said, what do the virtuous and successful men in Athens do? What is it that they do? And then what they do is the kind of thing that we should do. And that is where he drew his virtues from. And virtue became for him forming good habits that enable you to live. And that's a great idea, but it doesn't prove that human life or your life as an individual is the fundamental thing that is the ultimate value that you should pursue. Rand came along and did prove that. Rand actually proves that human life is the standard of moral value. And the way she proves it, I'm going to give you a very short version of it now because it's a more complex idea, but you'll get the basic idea. She says, in effect, why do we need morality at all? If we don't need it, then let's throw the thing away and get on with our business. We can go play cricket or have a cocktail or whatever. If we do need morality, then the reason why we need it is going to shed a lot of light on what is the right morality. So she defines morality. Morality is a code of values to guide your choices and actions. A code of values to guide your choices and actions. Now notice, this is a generic definition of morality. This fits with Christian morality, it fits with utilitarian morality, it fits with any moral code. It's a code of values to tell you how you should and shouldn't act. All right, well, if it's a code of values to tell us how we should and shouldn't act, then the key concept there is value. We don't need values, we don't need a code of values. So she zeroes in on that idea of value. What is a value? Well, a value is that which you act to gain or keep, she observes. And she sees this in nature and in human life. You value money, you pursue it. You act to gain and keep it. You value education, you act to gain and keep it. You value friendships, romance, and the like. You act to gain and keep these things. You value, if you're religious, you might value your relationship with God. You go to church, so you act to gain and keep that relationship, right? It's very generic. Again, it applies to any concept of value. And then she says, well, why do we need values at all? So we act to gain and keep these things. Why do we need to do that? And then she observes that a value is not a primary. It presupposes an answer to the question of value to whom and for what. Of value to whom and for what. You pursue money, the money is of value to you. You pursue education, the education is of value to you, and so on. So that answers the question to whom, but for what remains. What difference does it make if we achieve our values? And what difference does it make if we don't? What ultimately is at stake? And Rand answers this question by looking again at reality. If you do not get the things that you pursue, the things that you go after, and she sees this, by the way, not only with human beings, but with other animals, tigers, fish, birds. She sees it even in the plant kingdom. Plants shoot their roots down into the ground to go after nutrients, and they turn their leaves toward the sky. Why? To gain and keep nutrients and to gain and keep sunlight. What ultimately is at stake? What happens if a living thing does not get its values? It goes out of existence. Its life ceases to exist. She then says this, and this is one of the most profound paragraphs I think ever written. I'm going to just give you a short version of it. She says, there's only one fundamental alternative in the entire universe, and that is existence or non-existence. And it pertains to only one class of entities, living things. Inanimate matter cannot go out of existence. You can pummel a rock, you can burn it, melt it, you can light a tree on fire, light wood on fire, and you can burn it and make it go up in smoke, but you can't get rid of the material. The material stays. It either converts into energy or it just changes form or whatever. Life can go out of existence. Life literally can just go away. When a thing dies, that's what happens. And the whole purpose of the concept of value, the whole reason that values exist, is so that living things can pursue them, gain them, and continue living. This is sort of the inductive proof. This is the observation-based inductive proof that Rand has for why life is the standard of value for any given living thing, including human beings. We're living things just like a fish or a tree. The difference is simply that we have a faculty called reason that enables us to think and choose and live in a very special way. And if we want to do that thing, we have to take this seriously. So having discovered this, and I'm just going to go on for about 2 more minutes here, and then we'll take a Q&A. Having discovered this, Rand turns what is traditionally regarded as a non-scientific field, morality. You can't get values from facts, all that kind of stuff. You can't get an ought from an is. Rand turns a traditionally non-scientific field into precisely a scientific field. If the purpose of moral principles is to enable us to live as the kind of being that we are, then it's going to give us guidance about how to use our mind, how to act, how to be productive so that we can produce the values that we need, how to engage with other people in a harmonious way so that we can live with win-win relationships rather than with antagonistic or coercive relationships. And you see how this dovetails with her theory of rights, which is that you and you and you must be left free. I can't use force against you. You can't use force against me. Instead, what we do is we all use our minds, produce values, trade with each other, have win-win relationships, and guess what happens? They all flourish. Now, there are the questions about, people who can't take care of themselves, and a few, it's a very small number of people. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But I'll just wrap this up with this. Think about what this means. If Rand is right about this, then you're not going to take my word for this in a 45-minute talk. That's not the way things work. But if you look into Rand's idea, and if it's true, as I believe it is, that she came up with a solid rock foundation for freedom and individual rights, and a solid rock foundation for what morality is and what values are and what facts of reality give rise to them, this makes morality a science, just like any other science. They're true and false about whether cyanide will kill you and apples are good for you, right? And likewise for spiritual values, right? Self-esteem is good, purpose is good. Robbing banks is bad. Why? Because it's bad for human beings' lives. It's not good, right? Turns the whole thing into a science. So anyway, this is a short indication of Ayn Rand's philosophy for freedom and flourishing. I hope you look further into it. Toward that end, I recommend reading her books. The Virtue of Selfishness is all about her ethics, or it's her primary book about her ethics. Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal is a book that puts forth her political philosophy and her views on economics and shows how they dovetail with her ethics. And I wrote a short book titled, which Max mentioned earlier, Loving Life, the Morality of Self-Interest and the Facts that Support It, which is a very, very brief introduction to both her morality and her rights theory. Both of them are in that one book. So that's it. We'll take questions for a while. Thank you.
Let me just say 15 minutes on questions in Aristotelian Greek fashion. Bacchus calls downstairs, I understand. And then, yes, that's it. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yes, Eamon.
Just a second. Rand, I think, quite profoundly described rights as the political expression of the moral idea. But the point of moral ideas is they are essentially controversial. And it seems to me that what would you say to somebody who says that actually the defining characteristic of human beings is that we are a social species, and therefore instead of this all this individual stuff, we really ought to be doing what is good for society as a whole.
Great question. So what about the idea that the defining character of human beings is that we're social creatures rather than rational beings? Rand recognized and said that human beings are contractual creatures in a social setting. And I think she was right about that. What she meant by that is that when we're in a social setting, we need to form contracts with each other. That's what a trade is. You have a banana, I have a dollar. We'd agree to trade. That's a small contract. And all of our kinds of interactions are contracts. So I think she would agree that in a social setting, that contractual relationships are really good. Social animal as a broad term doesn't buy us much because I can attack you with a sword and we're engaging in social activities of some sort. There are two people doing something and that's social. So the concept of social doesn't carry much weight. But what Rand is really getting at by saying that we're a rational animal rather than saying that we're a social animal is this. If you are on a desert island, you still need to use your rational faculty to live, right? You're going to have to figure out, if you're all alone on an island, you're going to have to figure out what things are, how you can put them together, how you can fend off the wild animals, how you can catch fish or figure out what berries are edible, all of that kind of stuff. And you don't need a social environment to do that. You need your reasoning mind to do that. So at the fundamental level, at the level of an individual, it's just the case that your reasoning mind is what makes you different than all other animals. In a social setting, there's no question that we benefit enormously from other human beings. I mean, think about it, your business relationships, your grocer, your lover, your friends, your recreational partners, the people who write the books that you read, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Your doctor. We gain enormously from other people, but we can only gain from them when they are using their minds to be productive and create values that we can benefit from, whether friendship or a heart valve or whatever. And when they are free to do that thing so that we can have trade relationships and profit, and have win-win relationships. So social environment is very important, but only when people are acting like rational people. So, yes.
Your name is on this. Sorry.
Yeah, Tom Burrows. Great interesting presentation, good, nice summary of what was said. Occasionally I come across the following argument made by critics, which says that if life is a standard of value, and Rand said life property of man, qua man, QA.
Yeah.
People say, well, that can end up becoming like a circular argument because life is not simply just the avoidance of death. It means living as a way to profit to a human being, which then begs the question, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Now, I've seen some within sort of the Aristotelian position, like Douglas Rasmussen and others, say that the very sort of virtues that we cultivate to live and flourish are themselves what being a human being is. So, for some people, therefore, the idea of life as a standard of value comes freighted with a lot of other assumptions that are sometimes not always spelled out. What would you say to that?
Yeah, really good question. So the idea is, if you say that life is the standard of value, and Rand used the phrase, life as man qua man, Q-U-A is a fancy Latin term, meaning basically as man's nature essentially is. So living as the kind of being that you are, that's what qua would mean there. And the question is it a bit circular because you're saying, well, life is the standard of value. Why? Because we're this kind of being, and so we need to live in a certain way. Rand's idea here is very inductive. She's asking, in effect, do we need values, and if so, why? If we don't need values, let's get rid of this subject and go do something else. If we do need values, the reason we need values is going to shed a whole lot of light on what constitutes a proper value, the kind that serves the need that we're talking about, if we do need them. So it's not circular, it's inductive in the sense that she's getting down to the very base of what values are and what facts of reality give rise to them. I'll put it this way. Life is what makes values possible, and life is what makes values necessary. It's both things. You have to be alive to pursue values, and you only need to pursue values if you want to stay alive. It's what makes it necessary. That's the thing here. So it's not circular, it's inductive. It's looking at the actual nature of human beings and then saying, either we need values or we don't. Which one is it? And if we do need values, what are they for? What do they do? And so I don't think it's circular. And then the other thing that she does, the other part of your question is, well, who's to say what constitutes a proper human life? Who's to say what life as a human being is? Well, again, this becomes a scientific question. There are certain facts about the kind of animal that we are. Ayn Rand identifies 3 cardinal values. And this is a very nice way to answer this question, I think, because observe this. She looks at man and she says there are 3 values that human beings must identify and uphold and pursue if they want to live. Reason is our basic means of living, and it's our means of knowledge. It's how we understand what's true. That's just a fact. We know that this is true because we can look at reality and see, oh yeah, people figure out how to put things together by using their minds and figuring that out. That's what reason is. Purpose, we need purpose. We need long-range goals that give meaning to our life. We're not gnats. We don't live for a day or a moment, right? We live for decades, and we have very, very broad needs. We need friendship and love and all these different things. So purpose, the idea of setting goals in life. I'm going to build a relationship here. I'm going to build a business here. I'm going to play squash as my recreational activity or whatever. These are purposes, and she names that as a cardinal value. We need these things. And the third one is self-esteem. Self-esteem is simply the conviction that you're capable of dealing with reality and that you're worthy of success in reality. Well, where do those things come from? They come from doing things. You watch a child building with blocks, and he gets really excited when he gets it right, the Montessori method and all that. Kids are gaining self-esteem. They're realizing, oh, I can make things happen in reality. this is a factual requirement of human life. You know adults who have low self-esteem and they don't function well, and you know adults with high self-esteem and they do function well. That's a factual requirement of human life. Now observe one thing about these three values. They're all spiritual values. Rand is often called a materialist, as if she's only concerned with money and property and this, that, and the other. Far from it. Her three cardinal values are three spiritual values: the mind, reason. By spiritual, Rand means pertaining to consciousness. Good question. So somebody said, what spiritual in this sense? She does not mean religious spirituality. She means pertaining to consciousness, so something that's not physical. My goals in life, I want to be a pianist, right? That's not a physical thing. It's a projection. It's an idea, right? So these are spiritual values. And what Rand is saying, in effect, is that as a human being, you need these things, and it's not an opinion that you need them. If you don't use reason, you can't live. If you don't set purposes in life, you won't know what to do. If you don't have self-esteem, you won't have the conviction that you're capable of even doing anything. So it's a fact that you need these things. And then she goes on and talks about virtues in the same manner. A value is that which you act to gain or keep, she says, and a virtue is the action by which you gain it. Be productive. So she says you have to be productive in order to live. So productiveness is a virtue. Produce values so that you can have the values and trade them with others to get more values. It's a factual requirement of human life. If you're on a desert island and you don't produce, you'll die. If you're in society and you don't produce, you'll either live as a parasite on others who do produce, or you'll die. It's just a fact. So she's not making up the requirements of human life. She's identifying the actual requirements of human life. And she goes on, she's got virtues, the virtue of honesty. Don't fake reality. Why? Because reality is where values come from. If you pretend that facts are other than they are, you're putting yourself at odds with the realm of values. Have integrity. Go by rational principles. That's how she defines integrity. Why? Because reason and principles are your means of understanding the world and functioning, and so on and so forth. So she's got several virtues that are in this same vein. So I think it's not opinion, and she certainly didn't think it was opinion, and I don't think it is. She's pointing to facts. So in the very back, yes.
Is nature not missing from all this? I don't just mean psychology.
Are you saying, is human nature missing from this? From the analysis? I don't think so. Rand's view of human nature is still her. In psychology, there's no established scientific morals. Yeah, the field of psychology today, and for a long time, I think forever actually, has basically been on the premise that there is no such thing as a scientific morality. Rand is saying that that's not true. All right. Yeah. So, what was that about language?
Well, an animal's language using creatures, that's what humans are.
Yeah, some people say we're language using creatures, but Rand goes more fundamental. She says, what enables us to use language or to form language and use it? And she says it's the faculty of reason. So Rand's view of human nature is that we are rational, meaning we have the capacity to reason, and we must reason if we want to live, because it's our means of living. Pardon?
There's no model in science.
She's not going along with the traditional take on what constitutes a standard of moral value. She's saying that her method of approaching this is new and different, and she's saying that it's a fact that human beings have to take certain actions and do certain things in order to live. It's not opinion. And so she's saying that it is objectively the case that there are certain moral values that are pro-life and other values that are anti-life. And she's saying that the pro-life values, the values that sustain and support human life, are the good, and the actions that people take that are harmful to human life are precisely the bad. So she's making a black and white distinction, and she's breaking with the tradition that says there's no such thing as objective morality. She's saying there is objective morality.
Is psychology, is human nature not missing?
Her view of human nature is very interesting too, because she holds that we do have not only reason, but also free will. And I'm not sure how much time we have left, but do we have time for a little bit on this? 2 minutes? Okay, I'll say just a word about her view of free will, because this is very interesting. So in psychology, typically it's thought that our personalities and who we are come from two different things, nature and nurture, right? So they come from our genes, that's what nature is supposed to be, and nurture from our environment, how our parents raise us. Rand says that's an incomplete picture, and it's a false alternative, the idea that who you are comes from just those two things. She says, no, you also have free will. You have the capacity to choose. And she has a very specific definition of free will. It doesn't mean you can choose anything you want, anytime you want, anyway. It means simply this: you have the capacity to think or not to think, to use your mind or not use it. And if you choose to not use it, then what you're doing is defaulting to acting on the only other thing that you can act on, and that is your emotional faculty. You're just going to go by your feelings. Well, going by your feelings is not good for your life, because your feelings are as important as they are in a certain regard psychologically. They're not your means of knowledge. They're not your means of understanding the world. So she says, in effect, what free will enables you to do is fully focus your mind and figure out how to live well, and then let your emotions be what they're supposed to be, which is your psychological means of enjoying your values, right? Your football team wins, it's yay, and you feel great. That's what your emotions are for. Your best friend, you know, has a car accident and is in the hospital, and you feel rotten. Why? Because you value your friend. So your emotions have a very important aspect in your life, but they are not your means of knowledge. So she says, simply use your free will and use it correctly. Choose to think. That's the essence of it. So in psychology, she brings in a third element, and she says there's nurture and nature. Sure, you have genetic predispositions of some sort. You've got a temperament. You've got a height. You're gonna, you know, I'm never gonna be 6, you know, or whatever. So that's real. And your environment is important. If your parents beat you all the time, you're gonna have a rough life, and things are gonna be bad for you. If you have good parents and you live in a good situation, that's good. But free will has to always be brought into the picture, because it's a fact that you can choose to think or not think. So that's where she does a whole lot of work in psychology as well. Is that it?
That's time.
I'm happy to talk more downstairs. I think we'll be here for a little while, and I'm delighted to chat with anyone. So thanks.
Great. Well, a round of applause.
Thank you.